Okay, so to start off, we're just going to do a quick review of last week. If you remember, we talked about King Nebuchadnezzar, and that was around 587 BC. He overtook Jerusalem. That was the Babylonian Empire. And then from 587 to 538 BC, Jerusalem was pretty much empty. Everybody was exiled either to Egypt or to Babylon. So then in 538 BC, the Persian Empire overtook the Babylonian Empire. This is the Persian Empire, and then this is King Cyrus the Great. He's the one who is in charge of that whole revolution there, and the Persian Empire created an open door for the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. This guy, King Cyrus, provided religious freedom for pretty much every religion. And then so in 538 BC, when that happened, Zerubbabel leads a group of exiles back into Jerusalem, and it's about 50,000 people go back with him. And in 536 BC, they begin to rebuild the temple, and that was issued by a decree from King Cyrus. He's the one who issued that to allow them to continue building. 530 BC, the temple construction is halted due to various foreign resistances. We don't really know what halted them from building. If you remember back to last week, Ezra chapter 4, there's that letter about King Artaxerxes, which is about 100 years later. They use that to describe the stopping of the temple. So then in 521 or 520 BC, Haggai calls Judah to rebuild the temple for the returning Messiah. And then the temple construction is allowed to resume after King Darius goes back and he finds the decree written by King Cyrus. So in 516 or 515 BC, the temple is completed, and then in 458 BC, Ezra leads the second group of exiles back into Jerusalem. And this is about 1,500 men and their families. So if you can imagine 1,500 men plus their families on top of that, it's quite a big number. And then in 458 to 456 BC, Ezra leads the Jews to kind of repent from their sins. They were intermarrying, if you remember. And then 446 BC, about 10 years later, Nehemiah goes down. And this is the third group of exiles that go back to Jerusalem. If you remember, just to set the stage, Nehemiah's brother informs him of the walls yet to be rebuilt. This is 100 years after the first group of exiles went to Jerusalem, and the walls still were not built yet. The temple was built already, but the walls were not. And then Nehemiah, if you remember, he sits down and he just weeps and cries in front of his brother and his friends. So Nehemiah then goes before King Artaxerxes about 4 months later, and the king sees that he's sad. And then the king asks Nehemiah what he can do for him. And that's where we left off last week. So just wanted to refresh your memory. By the time Nehemiah returned, even after Ezra was there, the people repented. And by the time Nehemiah got there 10 years later, the same problem was happening all over again. People were intermarrying. And I was just thinking, Judah, this is fresh start number 3 when Nehemiah gets there. How many times has Israel throughout the course of its history, had to have a fresh start, and so much so with our lives. How many of our family members and friends that we know have walked away from God over and over again, even in our own lives, in our own histories, like when we were away from God, how empty we were, and just that God is a God of second chances and third chances, and just that care that He has so deeply for us.
I make one comment. The priests in Ezra's day, he found that they had intermarried outside of their sect. And he called for them to separate. The men were to leave their wives.
Yeah.
And that's important to grasp. That was a purity that was expected in the tribe of Levi, the priests. Just keep that in mind.
And not only were they intermarrying with pagans, but they were adopting their religious practice, and they were bringing that into the temple. So Ezra, he saw that, and he knew that a drastic change needed to take place. And so Nehemiah, he leads the third exile. We're going to start at chapter 2. We're going to reread verse 1 through 4. That's where we left off last week, verse 4. So we'll start on verse 1. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of the heart." So I became dreadfully afraid, and said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire?" Then the king said to me, "What do you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And can anybody remember what we talked about last week about that? Anything that you can recall? Why do you think Nehemiah was so afraid? So there's the fear of having to present his request. There's the fear of maybe the king thinks that he's up to something. His cupbearer is sad. Something's going on. This guy watches for the king's protection. He watches for his life. Maybe someone's trying to poison him. And then thirdly, why else might he be afraid? Anybody remember what we said last week? The reason I think
he spoke before he was requested.
right, he knew that he's about to ask the king something crazy. Because if you remember, King Artaxerxes and kings in the past, they're the ones that destroyed Jerusalem. Now he's going, and Jerusalem had a history of being throwing revolts against kings and stuff like that. So he's wanting to go back and rebuild the city that was destroyed on purpose. And King Artaxerxes is actually the one that wrote the letter for the walls to be torn down. We don't know if that was before or after Nehemiah got there, but King Artaxerxes is the same king that wrote that letter, which is written in Ezra chapter 4. So.
Wasn't he afraid that the king would kill him if he would ask the throne of?
Right. We don't have an exact reason why he's afraid. It could have been a number of different reasons. Those three reasons, though, are most likely the reasons why he was so afraid in that situation. Okay, so now we're going to continue to verse 5, and we're going to read down to verse 6. We're not going to get through this whole thing tonight. We'll probably get about halfway. So verse 5, "And I said to the king," and listen to these words here, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. So if you remember last week when I closed in prayer, I kind of reflected on these words a little bit. The significance of speaking to a king. Just his first words there, he gives reverence to the king. If it pleases the king, when we present our request to the King of Kings, it's important that we present our request if it pleases the king, if we ask in his name, according to his will. And then to continue, "And if your servant has found favor in your sight," he's saying to the king, if I'm pleasing in your sight, if my life before you is pleasing, and then he presents his request. And it just kind of struck me as I look back at not only this reference in the Bible, but throughout the course of history of people talking to kings. I think a lot of that is lost in today's culture. If you think of the way sometimes that we talk to God, the way we present our requests, we can command God. Who are we to command our Creator who created us? And then I was just reflecting back on some scriptures. I'll read them to you, some of them, and then the other ones you can just write down. Ecclesiastes 5:2. "Do not be quick with your mouth, or be hasty to utter anything in your heart before God. God is in heaven, you are on earth. Let your words be few." And then Jesus speaking. Matthew 16:4. "A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Jesus then left them and went away." So does anyone know what the sign of Jonah is? Right. And that's likened to Jesus dying and being resurrected in 3 days. Then I'll just give you a couple more scriptures here to look up at your time home. James 4:1-6. Luke 18, verse 1-8. This is a parable Jesus used about people repeatedly asking the same thing in prayer. John 14:13. It's about God doing anything for us when we ask in his name. Matthew 14, verse 23. This is just showing that Jesus oftentimes went to be alone to pray. He went off by himself and prayed. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7. Jesus used loud cries and petitions. John chapter 20, verse 29. Blessed are those who don't see and still believe. And then finally, Luke chapter 11, verse 1-13. Jesus set the example for prayer. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Okay, so this picture here is actually Nehemiah's journey from Susa, where he was with the king, and then he had to go up to Jerusalem. Same kind of route, going up alongside the river, and then back down. So we find that in this portion that we read already, that the king asks him how long he's going to be gone. Nehemiah doesn't tell him the exact time that he's going to be gone to Jerusalem, but it figures out to be about 12 years, as we'll find out. Okay, so we'll continue chapter 2, verse 7-10. Okay, furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel which pertains to the temple, for the city wall and for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me, according to the good hand of my God upon me. Okay, so then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So we'll stop right there. So earlier we saw that Nehemiah was afraid, but here he presents his bold request. He not only asks the king for a letter petitioning for his safety, but he asks for pretty much all the timber he's going to need. You can imagine that's got to be costly. All the wood to build the gates, it had to be pretty expensive. He's asking the king to pay for all that to the city that was destroyed on purpose, to rebuild the wall that was destroyed on purpose, and he's presenting this to the king. So we can see that he doesn't shy away. And then the king grants Nehemiah's request, and it says, because the hand of God was upon Nehemiah. And the king also graciously supplies Nehemiah with the captains of the army and horsemen to escort him. He's got people to go alongside him, so for protection. Then we're introduced to these two guys here, Sanballat and Tobiah. And we're going to learn more about these guys. They present a lot of problems down the road for Nehemiah. So we'll continue verse 11 through 20. Okay, so I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put on my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except for the one that I rode on. And I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates which were burned with fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So you can imagine just the picture, that everything was so destroyed that his animal, he had to get off of his animal to get through there. Okay, verse 15. So I went up in the night by the valley and viewed the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. Then I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be called a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us, and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? So I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will rise and build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. Okay, so we'll just go over that. So we first see that Nehemiah keeps all of his plans to himself. That shows great wisdom. If you look back to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, there's a time for everything. It gives a whole list, a time to speak, a time to keep quiet, a time for laughing, a time for mourning. Nehemiah knows here that he has to keep his plans quiet, because if people find out, like Sanballat and Tobiah, if they find out beforehand, they're going to put a halt to it before it even starts. So what we see happen is there'd already been 3 days that he was there, and he gets up at night. Why may he have gotten up at nighttime, do you think? Right. Even if during the day, if someone sees him and asks him why he's looking at the wall, his whole thing would be exposed. What is he going to say, So we're going to look at this picture here. And this here shows us the gate. And this one right here, whoops, I use blue. This one right here is the valley gate. That's where he went out. He was in Jerusalem. He went outside the gate. And then he walked around to the dung port. Let's see, where's the dung port? It's over here. And then he goes to the gate of the fountain. That's over here. Then he goes to the King's Pool, or the brook. That's inside, I think. Maybe this right here. Not too sure. It looks like a pool. And then he goes back outside, and then he goes back to the valley gate. And that's his whole route for that night, that evening that he scouted So he didn't really go around the whole thing and look at all the walls. He just kind of scouted this portion right here. Okay. So in verse 16, we see that he hadn't told anybody yet. But then in verse 17, that's when he tells the people of Jerusalem. He pretty much reveals his plan to everybody. And the first thing he does is he tells the people that King Artaxerxes had sent him, which pretty much, he pretty much is authenticating himself that he's from Susa, is where Artaxerxes was. So, and that the king had sent him. He had letters, and he had the officials that came with him and everything. So, and then he expresses to the people that God's hand had been upon him. And just one more quick thing about walls. We talked a little bit about walls last week, the importance of walls and the significance of walls. Not only were they protection, but back then in those days, only the significant cities of the day and age had walls. Any city that didn't have walls was kind of like a joke, like a laughing stock, not an important city. So Jerusalem, the city, God's own territory, was pretty much a laughing stock. And Nehemiah then boldly proclaims Jerusalem will no longer be called a disgrace, and he rallies the people together to action. And the response of the people in Jerusalem was immediate, but so was the response of the opposition, as we'll find out. So we're introduced to Geshem at the end there. We've already met Sanballat and Tobiah. So all three men laugh at him and mock him and despise him in front of his counterparts. They kind of accuse him of rebelling against the king, and the king is the one that sent him. So Nehemiah tells them, he says, they'll have no part in the rebuilding. And you can imagine that these words would only make them even angrier than they already were at that time. So
You want to keep in mind that the wall was not a small width structure. It was huge. They were able to drive chariots on the top of it. So when they're rebuilding this thing, it's a massive project. And I had the opportunity to walk around that wall, so I know.
yeah, back then in Nehemiah's time, we'll find out later, Jerusalem was a lot smaller than it is today. Even in Jesus' time, there's a huge contrast in the size of Jerusalem. You'll see that it's a lot smaller back then. Because you can remember, there was nobody there for almost 80 years. So, okay, here's another video really quick. Okay, so we're not going to read chapter 3 because basically chapter 3 is Nehemiah giving us a tour around the walls. He pretty much lists all the gates that are being reconstructed, and he starts at the sheep gate. The sheep gate is right here. And then he kind of gives us a tour going around this way. Just some significant things from chapter 3, though. The sheep gate was built by the high priest and some of the brethren priests. The sheep gate was used to bring in the sheeps and the other animals that were used as sacrifices. So Nehemiah, you'll find out in this chapter here that he strategically places people to rebuild according to where the area that's most important to them. So we have the priests working on this one here. Then we have the old gate, this is also called the old gate right here. This one. It's the Yeshanah gate. And then if you keep going, there's House of Jediah. Number 1 right here. So Jediah is listed in chapter 3 between verse 6 and 12. He's listed as building this portion of wall right here. So he builds closest to where his house is. And the priests are building closest to where the sheep come in. Another significant thing in between verse 13 through 24, it lists Nehemiah as one of the names that was rebuilding. This is actually a different Nehemiah, though. Just like back then, there's people with the same name. This one was the son of Azbuk. And the Nehemiah that came from, he was the son of Hekeliah. So 2 different people. The dung gate, which is listed as being right over here. That's where, does anybody know what dung is? Yeah. That's where they would bring out their garbage. So that would be where they'd bring all that stuff out. Then we have Azariah, the house of Azariah, number 8, right over there. He was also listed as building near his house, so right over there. And then there's a bunch of different, there's the horse gate, a bunch of priests built right over there. That's where they lived. Number 10, the house of the priests. So that's the most significant thing that I got out of chapter 3, just that Nehemiah, he strategically placed people in areas of importance related to that individual. It's kind of a brilliant thing that he did. So we'll continue. We'll get about halfway through chapter 4. We'll start off verse 1. But it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads, and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out before you. For they have provoked you to anger before the builders. Okay, we'll pause right there. So we're going to just take a look at Sanballat and Tobiah. Does anybody know who they are? Okay, Sanballat was actually the governor of Samaria. And this is a region just north of Judea. And then Tobiah is an Ammonite official. We don't know exactly his, but I read that they may possibly believe that he may have been the governor of the Transjordan area. So why are Sanballat and Tobiah so concerned about Nehemiah coming to Jerusalem?
So maybe Nehemiah will be the king.
What was that?
They were thinking that Nehemiah was trying to be the king.
Right, they thought he was trying to become the king. Anything else?
They've had pretty much free reign in that area.
Yeah.
As being the two monarchs.
Yeah.
Or governing individuals. They didn't want to give it up.
Yeah, and we'll read later that Tobiah actually had family in Jerusalem. So he had ties, and he was actually, a lot of people in Jerusalem had favor in their eyes towards Tobiah for some reason. And if you think back all the way to Zerubbabel, the people that he rejected, that he didn't want their help, those people were from Samaria. So there was bad blood already. And if you think back even further to when Assyria overtook Samaria, what's the guy's name? Let's see. Sargon, who was the leader of Assyria, he brought in people of other nationalities, and they interbreeded with the Jews. So it formed like a whole new race. So it was pretty much like racism back then. Like the Jews didn't like the Samaritans, and the Samaritans didn't like the Jews, if you can imagine. And also, Nehemiah was no ordinary exile. He was the king's cupbearer. And like Sister Helen said, if he rebuilt Jerusalem, it was a threat to the Samaritan officials who perhaps they may have actually wanted to overtake Jerusalem for themselves. Jerusalem was a small place back then, so they could have had that for themselves. So then to end that portion there, they ridicule and they mock Nehemiah. Nehemiah responds not with revenge, but prayer for justice. And if you think back to even the book of Psalms with King David, some people back then were accusing David of trying to kill Saul. And he offers up a very similar prayer in chapter 7 of Psalms. It's a prayer for the justice, and vengeance is the Lord's. So we'll just watch one more here. Okay, so we'll stop right here for tonight. So next week we're gonna finish up chapter 4 and then go to chapter 5 and 6, and then we'll close at that for this study. We're not gonna go all the way through the whole book of Nehemiah. We're just focusing on the process of rebuilding the wall, which is the first chapter through chapter 6.